Hello everyone, my name is Sofia, welcome to my channel. In this video I'll show you how to knit these basic mittens. They fit the hand really well and sit comfortably without being too loose. For this project I'll be using Baby Bliss yarn made of 100% Australian merino wool. One skein weighs 50 grams and contains 86 meters of yarn, and the color is called Lagoon. The recommended needle size for this yarn is 4 millimeters. To knit both mittens and the gauge swatch, I'll need approximately 60 to 70 grams of yarn. That's why I purchased two 50 gram skeins. I'll be knitting the mittens using double-pointed needles. I'll need two different needle sizes, a smaller size for the cuff and a larger size for the main part of the mitten. As I mentioned, the recommended needle size for this yarn is 4 millimeters, but I prefer a denser fabric for mittens, so I'll use 3.5 millimeters needles for the main part of the mitten and one size smaller, in my case 3.25 millimeters for the cuff. Needles in 3 millimeters would also work well for the cuff. To take measurements, I'll need a ruler and a flexible measuring tape. I'll also need sharp scissors, stitch markers and a large eye yarn needle to weave in ends and slip stitches of the needles. To calculate how many stitches to cast on and how many rows to knit, I'll first make a stockinette stitch gauge swatch. I take my larger needles 3.5 millimeters and cast on 20 stitches using the classic long tail cast on method. I have a separate detailed video showing how to cast on stitches using this method. You'll find the link in the top right corner of the screen and in the video description. I've cast on the stitches. Now I carefully remove one of the needles and turn my work. To create a neat edge stitches in every row, the first stitch is slipped onto the right needle without knitting it. Next, in the first setup row, all stitches are worked through the front loop. In this row, I need all stitches knitwise, except for the last stitch. I've reached the last stitch of the row. When knitting flat to create clean edges, the last stitch of every row is always purled. I turn the work. Now I'll knit the second row. Again, I slip the first stitch of the row without knitting it. And next, I purl all the stitches of the row through the front loop. The next, third row is a knit row. I slip the first stitch without knitting it. Then I knit all the stitches through the back loop, except for the last stitch, which I purl. This is how I will continue knitting. All odd-numbered rows are knit rows, and all even-numbered rows are purl rows. For the swatch, I need to knit approximately from 15 to 20 rows. Since I won't be washing the swatch and will unravel it after taking measurements to reuse the yarn for the mittens, I won't try to save yarn and will knit 20 rows. I've finished knitting the swatch. I've completed 20 rows. Let me remind you that normally we bind off the swatch, wash it, let it dry and only then take measurements. But for mittens I don't do this, because mittens allowed for a small measurement inaccuracies and don't have to fit the hand perfectly. So I simply remove the swatch from the needles and lay it flat on the table. I'll measure it in two directions. The width of my swatch is 9 centimeters. And the height of my swatch is 7.5 centimeters. After I took the measurements, I can unravel the swatch. Now I need to take measurements of my hand. I take a flexible measuring tape and measure my hand at its widest point. My measurement is 19 centimeters. Next, I need to measure the length from the wrist crease to the tip of the index finger. To do this, I place the measuring tape on the table, align the wrist crease with the beginning of the tape, and the tip of my finger reaches 17.5 centimeters. Please note, if you wear long nails, you should measure all the way to the tip of the nail. I also need to measure the length of the thumb from the base to the tip. I place my thumb along the measuring tape and its length is 6 centimeters. And now I can move on to the calculations. The width of my swatch is 9 centimeters and I cast on 20 stitches for the swatch. The width of my palm is 19 centimeters. I'll call the required number of stitches X. To calculate X, I multiply 19 by 20 and then divide by 9. This gives me approximately 42 stitches. I'll knit the cuff of the mitten using a 2x2 rib. The pattern repeat is 4 stitches, so the total number of stitches must be divisible by 4. I choose the closest number that is divisible by 4 and less than 42, which is 40 stitches. I'll cast on one additional stitch at the beginning to join the work in the round, so in total I need to cast on 41 stitches. Next, I'll calculate how many rows I need to knit from the cuff up to the beginning of the decreases. In my swatch, I knitted 20 rows and the height of the swatch is 7.5 centimeters. The length of my hand from the wrist to the tip of the index finger is 17.5 centimeters. I'll call the required number of rows X. To calculate X, I multiply 17.5 by 20 and divide by 7.5. This gives me approximately 46 rows. From these 46 rows, I'll subtract one row. This row will be a 0 row and won't be included in the overall row count. When we start knitting, I'll show you where this row is and why it's needed. Next, I'll calculate how many rows I need to knit for the thumb. The swatch measurements are the same, 7.5 centimeters for 20 rows. The height of my thumb is 6 centimeters. Again, I'll call the required number of rows X. To calculate X, I multiply 6 by 20 and divide by 7.5. This gives me approximately 16 rows. I'll bind off the thumb stitches over 2 rows, so I'll knit 16 minus 2, which is 14 rows, straight in the round, and then work 2 rows of decreases. Now I'm ready to cast on the stitches. I'm taking the smaller needles and I'll cast on the stitches using 2 needles held together. This helps prevent the cast on edges from being too tight. I cast on all 41 stitches at once and then distribute the stitches 10 stitches per needle. The extra stitch stays on the needle with the working yarn. This will be the 4th needle. It's also important to lay the needles flat on the table and check that the stitches are not twisted. If needed, carefully straighten them. Now I'll join the work in the round. As I always say, there are different ways to do this. I'll show you the method I use. In my left hand I have the needle with the extra stitch. I slip this stitch onto the right needle and then I pull the first stitch from the right needle through this extra stitch. As a result, the extra stitch slips off the needles. I tighten it by gently pulling the short yarn tail. Then I place the stitch from the left needle back onto the right needle to keep the stitch count even. The short yarn tail will now serve as a marker, showing where one round ends and the next one begins. I take the 5th needle and start knitting the cuff in a 2x2 rib. Since this is the first setup round, I work all stitches through the front loop. At the beginning I knit 2 stitches, then purl 2 stitches and repeat this pattern to the end of the round. The round should end with 2 purl stitches. I've completed the first round of ribbing and make a note that this round is finished. You can use a row counter, but when knitting paired items such as socks or mittens, I find it very helpful to keep written notes to make sure both pieces turn out the same size. Here is my short yarn tail. I'm back at the beginning of the round. Now I'll knit the second round. In the second round and in all following ribbing rounds, I continue knitting in pattern, 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches. The knit stitches are worked through the front loop and the purl stitches are worked through the back loop. This is because we are knitting in the round and the orientation of the stitches on the left needle is different from when we were knitting the swatch flat. How many ribbing rounds should you knit? On average, it's usually about 20 rounds or approximately 6 to 8 centimeters in length. I plan to knit 20 rounds, which will create a comfortable cuff, not too short and not too long. I've finished knitting all 20 rounds of the cuff and I've written everything down in my notes. When knitting adult-sized mittens, you can occasionally try them on to check the fit. I don't recommend trying mittens on a child as the needles are sharp and this can be unsafe. Next, I need to knit the 0 round in all knit stitches. In this round, I'll switch from the smaller needles to the larger ones. This is exactly the round that we subtracted earlier from the total number of rows in our calculations. I put the 5th smaller needle back into its case and take the first larger needle, which in my case is 3.5 millimeters. And now I start knitting all stitches knitwise. Where I have knit stitches on the left needle, I knit them through the front loop. And where I have purl stitches, I also knit them, but through the back loop. I've finished knitting all the stitches on the first needle and I put the freed smaller needle back into its case. Then I take a larger needle and continue knitting in the same way to the end of the round, gradually switching all needles from the smaller size to the larger size. I've completed the 0 round and I make a note of this in my records. Next, I'll start making increases and separating the stitches for the thumb. The increases will be worked in a specific point, so I need to place a stitch marker. For the thumb, I'll allocate the number of stitches on one needle +1 and +2. I have 10 stitches on one needle. +1 and +2, that gives me 13 stitches. I count 13 stitches from the beginning of the round and place a marker. Why these unusual calculations, +1 and +2? Why not just add 3? Because I'll be making as many increases as I have stitches on one needle +1. For my mitten, that means 11 increases. Later, I'll also leave exactly 11 stitches for the thumb, and the extra 2 stitches were counted to shift the thumb slightly away from the center, which creates a more anatomical and comfortable fit. Now I start knitting the first row of the continuous row count. I knit all stitches knitwise up to the marker. I've reached the marker and slip it from the left needle onto the right needle. For the right mitten, the increases are made after the marker. With my right needle, I pick up the far strand of the working yarn, which is over my index finger, moving the needle towards myself, and tighten the loop on the needle. This is my first increase. And then I continue knitting all stitches knitwise to the end of the round. I've completed the first round and I note this in my records. I also make a note that an increase was made in this round. In the second round, I knit all stitches knitwise with no increases. I've reached the marker in this second round and slip it over. Now I work an increased stitch through the back loop and then continue knitting all stitches knitwise to the end of the round. I've finished the second round without increases and make a note of it in my records. Now I start knitting the third round. Increases are made in odd numbered rounds. I'll show you once again how to make the increase. I've reached the marker. Slip it onto the right needle and make an increase after the marker. To do this with my right needle, I pick up the far strand of the working yarn over my index finger, moving the needle towards myself, and tighten the loop on the right needle. Then I continue knitting all stitches knitwise to the end of the round. At this point, I think it's clear how the increases are made. The increases are worked in every odd numbered round, and each even numbered round is knitted knitwise with no increases. I need to make 11 increases, which means I'll knit a total of 22 rounds. I've completed all 22 rounds and marked each one in my notebook. I tried the mitten on and I like how it fits at this stage. It's neither too wide nor too tight. Now I'll set aside the stitches for the thumb, because I'll knit the thumb after finishing the main body of the mitten. For the thumb, I allocated 11 stitches plus 2 additional stitches. First, I need to knit these 2 stitches. Next, I'll slip the 11 thumb stitches. These are exactly the stitches up to the marker. There are 2 ways to do this. For the first method, I use a large eye yarn needle and a piece of contrasting yarn. I slip the stitches onto the needle threaded with this yarn. And then I tie the yarn so that the slipped stitches don't slide off or unravel. The second method uses stitch markers because they work as safety pins. I simply slip 3 stitches onto each marker, making sure to close it. Since the short yarn tail at the edge of the work is no longer convenient as a reference, I attach a marker at the beginning of the round. Because I slipped exactly the same number of stitches as the number of increases I made, the number of stitches remaining on the needles is the same as at the beginning, 40 stitches. That means I can distribute them evenly again, 10 stitches per needle. So I continue knitting the 23rd round. I've already knitted 2 stitches before slipping the thumb stitches, and now I'm knitting the stitches after them. I make sure to pull the yarn snugly on all these stitches so that no holes form in this area later. Here you can see a large loop, but this loop belongs to the previous round. It became this large because the slipped stitches transferred the yarn to it. When we start knitting the thumb, this loop will tighten back to its normal size. I've knitted 10 stitches on the first needle. Now I take the 5th needle and knit the rest of the round to the end. Next, I'll continue knitting in the round with knit stitches until I reach 45 rounds in total. After that, I'll come back and show you how to work the decreases and bind off the mitten. I also wanted to show you what to do if, while knitting, a stitch slips off the left needle, you don't catch it in time and it starts to unravel. With my right needle, I catch the stitch that I can reach and move it back onto the left needle. Now I need to knit it from the ladder that has formed behind the needles. I hold and tension this ladder with the fingers of my left hand. And yes, I don't let go of the left needle at the same time. This is a bit of a tricky moment. I pick up the ladder with my right needle and knit it as a knit stitch. Then I return this stitch to the left needle and continue knitting. I've finished knitting 45 rounds and now it's time to start the decreases. I don't write the decreases down in my notebook, because they're worked according to a rule, not by counting rows. But of course, if you prefer, you can write them down as well. I also double-checked that I knitted the correct number of rows. Let me remind you, I had 45 rounds plus 1 zero round, for a total of 46 rounds. I look at the column of knit stitches that starts from the cuff, in the area where the cuff had purl stitches. Each knit stitch looks like the letter V. I count how many of these V-shaped stitches are in the column 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. I counted 46, so everything matches. Now I start working the decreases and closing the stitches. I'll make decreases in every round and on every needle. On the first needle, I knit the first stitch. Then I knit 2 stitches together as one knit stitch through the front loops with a right leaning decrease, like this. After that, I knit all stitches knitwise until the last 3 stitches on the second needle. I've reached the last 3 stitches on the second needle. Here I need to make a left leaning decrease. To do this, I slip 2 stitches onto the right needle and then return them to the left needle, twisting them. Now I knit these 2 stitches together through the back loops as one knit stitch, creating a left leaning decrease. The last stitch on this needle I also knit knitwise. The decreases on the third needle are worked the same way as on the first needle, and on the fourth needle the same way as on the second needle. I'll show this once more without commentary. So, I will continue making decreases this way until I have 3 stitches left on each needle. Now I have 3 stitches on each needle and I'll work one more decrease round and collect all stitches onto 2 needles. I knit the first stitch. Then I knit 2 stitches together with a right leaning decrease. I set the freed needle aside, I won't need it anymore. On the same needle in my right hand, I knit the stitches from the second needle. And next, onto the freed needle, I knit the stitches from the third and fourth needles. After that, I put one more needle back into its case. Now I will work one more decrease round, making right leaning decreases. Everything is ready. At this point, I can cut the working yarn. I like to leave a long tail, so it's easier to weave in later. I thread the yarn tail into a large eye needle. Now I'll use this needle to remove the stitches from the needles. I look at which stitch I would knit next if I were continuing, and I start removing stitches from that stitch. I insert the needle the same way I would insert a knitting needle from left to right. I slip this stitch off and pull the needle and yarn through it. I do this with all the remaining stitches. Now I pass the needle through the opening that has formed and pull it through from the inside. I turn the mitten inside out. I pull the yarn tail, tightening the opening, and get ready to tie a knot. Here is the spot where I've gathered the stitches. This is where I'll tie the knot. I pass the needle from one side to the other and tighten the knot. Then I do the same in the perpendicular direction and tie a double knot. I won't cut the yarn yet. Once I finish knitting the thumb, I'll weave in all the yarn ends, including this one. I remove the beginning of round marker, I don't need it anymore, and I start knitting the thumb. To do this, I need to pick up 4 stitches onto the needle. I carefully untie the yarn that was holding the slip stitches, and I look right here where the columns of knit stitches separate and form a small corner. Here I can see one stitch and a second stitch. These are the stitches I'll pick up onto the needle. And on the other side I pick up 2 more stitches in the same way. I've picked up 4 stitches and I still have 11 stitches that were held on the yarn. That gives me a total of 15 stitches. I'll distribute these stitches over 3 needles, 5 stitches per needle. So on this needle I'll slip 1 more stitch. Now I slip the remaining stitches onto the other 2 needles. I won't remove the yarn until all stitches are transferred to the needles. All stitches are now on the needles and I can remove the yarn. You can start knitting the thumb from any stitch you like. It's most convenient for me to start with the stitches I picked up at the beginning. I simply take the working yarn and start knitting. Since the yarn isn't secured yet, during the first 2 rounds the stitches in this area may loosen, so they need to be tightened. To do this, I pull the short yarn tail through the opening into the inside of the mitten, and after knitting a few stitches, I gently pull on it to tighten the stitches. I knit the rest of the stitches in the round knitwise as usual. I've finished knitting the first round of the thumb, and I make a note of this in my records. Let me remind you that I need to knit 14 rounds before starting the decreases. Now I begin knitting the second round. If needed, you can also place a beginning of round marker here, but I usually orient myself by the increase row, since that's where I started knitting the thumb from. And again, I tighten the stitches slightly by pulling the yarn tail and then continue knitting. I'll come back once it's time to close the thumb stitches. My mitten is almost finished. I tried it on to check the fit and everything looks good. The thumb is almost complete and it's time to start the decreases. I'll work the decreases over 2 rounds. I knit the stitches 2 together through the front loops as one knit stitch, creating a right leaning decrease. I tighten all stitches well so that no holes form. I collect the resulting stitches onto 2 needles. I have an odd number of stitches on the needles, 15 stitches, so I'll make 7 decreases and I knit the last remaining stitch simply as a knit stitch. Then I knit 1 more round in exactly the same way. I've completed all the decreases and now I'll remove the stitches and pull them tight the same way I did for the main body of the mitten. I cut the yarn and thread it into a needle. I look for the beginning of the round stitch and start from there. I remove the stitches, inserting the needle from left to right. Then I tie 2 knots around the gathered stitches. The first one is a single knot and the second one is a double knot. Now I'll immediately show you how to weave in the yarn ends. Some of you, like me, may prefer to do this after finishing each mitten, rather than waiting until both mittens are done. First, it is important to secure the yarn used to start knitting the thumb, and to hide the yarn end near the cuff. The other 2 yarn ends are already well secured and are located inside the mitten, so if you leave them loose, they won't be visible and won't interfere when wearing the mittens. Just cut the ends a little bit shorter, or you can weave them in too, it's up to you. Let's start by securing the yarn that remains where I started knitting the thumb. I thread it into a needle and check whether there are any loose stitches or holes in this area. If there are, I tie a knot around the hole using the needle and yarn. This way I both secure the yarn and make the mitten look neater. I always make a double knot as well. Now I'll show you how to hide the yarn ends that are located on the wrong side of the mitten. I thread the yarn end into a needle and look at the fabric structure. On the wrong side, the knitted fabric looks like waves. I look for the tops of the waves and pass the needle with yarn through them. It's important to choose these points diagonally or in a zigzag pattern. Otherwise, the yarn may show through on the right side. In this way, I'll hide the end of the yarn about this far, and I'll do the same with all 3 ends inside the mitten. And now I'll show you how to hide the yarn end near the cuff. Right next to the yarn end there is a column of knit stitches. Important, this is the wrong side of the mitten. I insert the needle with yarn into the nearest knit stitch, catching the left leg of the stitch. I pull the yarn all the way through and even tighten it slightly. Then I continue in the same way upwards for a height of 10 stitches. After that I work back in the opposite direction for about 5 stitches, but this time catching the other legs of the stitches. Well, the right mitten is finished, and it's time to start knitting the left mitten. Now look, after knitting the first mitten I have 16 grams of yarn left, which is less than a half a skein. This means that if I start the second mitten using this leftover yarn, I'll have to join a new skein later, which would result in 1 extra knot and 2 additional yarn ends to weave in. I don't want that, so I'll start knitting the second mitten with a new skein. Also, when knitting the left mitten, I'll only briefly mention the steps that are identical to the right mitten, and I'll go into detail only on the step that is different. So I take the smaller needles and cast on 41 stitches. Then I distribute the stitches over 4 needles. I've cast on the stitches, checked that they are not twisted, and join the work in the round. After joining in the round, I start knitting 20 rounds of the cuff in 2x2 ribbing. I've finished the first ribbing round and mark it off in my notes. Then I continue knitting the remaining 19 ribbing rounds. The ribbing is finished, and now comes the 0 round, a round of knit stitches and a change to the larger needles. We've now reached the point where knitting the left mitten differs from knitting the right one. At this stage I need to separate the thumb stitches and place a marker. On the right mitten I counted from the beginning of the round, that is from the first needle, and the total number of stitches is number of the stitches on one needle plus 1 plus 2. Now I'll count the same number of stitches but from the left side, that is from the end of the second needle, starting here. And here I place the marker. Then I knit all stitches in knit stitches up to the marker. I've reached the marker. On the right mitten the increases were made after the marker, so on the left mitten they are made before the marker. How I make an increase on the left mitten? Here, the working yarn is on my index finger. I pick it up with my middle finger and thumb, twist it and place it onto the right needle. This creates an increase. Then I slip the marker and continue knitting knit stitches to the end of the round. The second round is worked without increases, but I'll show you how to knit the increased stitch. I've reached the increased stitch and I knit it through the back loop, like this. That's it. Then I continue knitting knit stitches to the end of the round. The third round is an increase round, and I'll show once again how to make the increase. I've reached the marker and make an increase by twisting a loop from the working yarn, like this. I think it's now clear how to make increases on the left mitten. In total, I need to make 11 increases and knit 22 rounds. Now it's time to slip the thumb stitches and continue knitting in the round. I knit stitches up to the marker. I've reached the marker, remove it and slip onto markers as many stitches as I made increases, in my case 11 stitches. And that's it. I continue knitting in the round, making sure to tighten the stitches well at this point. And then I distribute the stitches just like at the beginning, 10 stitches per needle. I've finished all 45 rounds and now I'll start the decreases and close the stitches of the main body of the mitten. I begin decreasing in every round and on every needle. All done, now it's time to transfer the stitches onto a needle with yarn and tie the knots. Now look, I have 2 yarn leftovers, a smaller one from knitting the first mitten and a larger one from knitting the second mitten. Since I need to join yarn anyway to knit the thumb, I'll use the smaller leftover for that and keep the larger one intact. It might come in handy in the future. Let me remind you that to knit the thumb, I need to pick up 4 stitches and distribute all the stitches over 3 needles. I don't remove the markers until all stitches are transferred onto the needles. Then I will knit in the round with knit stitches. I need to knit 14 rounds and then I'll make 2 decrease rounds. After that, I'll gather the remaining stitches using a needle and yarn and tie the knots. At the end on the left mitten, I also wave in the ends and secure the yarn tail from where I started knitting the thumb. And now the left mitten is also finished. Finally, I'll definitely do the wet blocking. I'll hand wash the mittens in cool water using a special liquid detergent for wool, then gently squeeze out the excess water and dry the mittens flat on a horizontal surface. My mittens are washed and fully dry, and now I trim the yarn ends on the inside. In this video, I also want to show you how I store leftover yarn. I never throw away nice small balls. Today I'm using a plastic Ziploc bag, but I also often use paper bags or small gift bags. I put the yarn leftovers into the bag and always keep the label as well. This way, if I ever need to use these leftovers, I can easily remember the fiber content and the recommended needle size from the manufacturer. I also often write on the label what was knitted from this yarn. That way, after some time, I can remember whether I liked how the item wore, whether the yarn peeled or not, and if everything was fine, I will consider buying the same yarn again for the future projects. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching this video till the end. I hope you found it helpful. If so, please give it a like or add it to your knitting playlist. Don't forget to subscribe and I will see you in the next one. Bye!